Ajax versus Borussia Dortmund. Ajax playing at home, and if that wasn't advantage enough, Borussia Dortmund were missing key players in Moray, the right back, Giovanni Reina, attacking midfielder, Mahmoud Daoud, like left-sided centre midfield, and Rafael Guerreiro, the left back. Borussia Dortmund were depleted, but regardless, Ajax absolutely dismantled them this game. If you enjoy the videos on this channel, please smash the like button. It goes a really long way with a small channel such as ours. Please look in the description or in the comment section. We'll try and post the summary of the notes of this game. With that, let's get into the analysis. Starting with Ajax, I'd say that they typically set up in possession in a 2-1-2-1-4. Got a lot of freedom of movement among those wide midfielders as well as also the wide centre midfielders. So we're talking about here Gravenberch, who I thought had a really excellent game, but then also Berghaus and also Tadic. So Tadic here has come in from the left wing and is moving towards that right hand side, something that Ajax like to do, where you have both wide midfielders on one side. In that 2-1-2, that second two, you actually have the fullbacks who push really aggressively high up the pitch. This helps with both overloading in the wide spaces, but then also it also helps with counter pressing. Given the way that Borussia Dortmund typically pressed, which started off in a 4-3-3, so you typically have Marlon, the left winger for Borussia Dortmund, ex-Ajax player of course, curve his press to try and cover first the fullback of Ajax, but then try and press towards the centre back. But this, in this occasion, actually leaves a little bit of a gap to be able to play the ball into Mazraoui, who I thought had an excellent game as well. To be honest, all the Ajax players had excellent games. So Ajax did what they typically do, and they pass and move, and they did it really, really well, constantly shifting positions, having obviously a lot of players overloading certain spaces. They were typically trying to overload the right-hand half space, and then if they couldn't make any headway there, then they would try and take it to the other side. And this is the next stage of that same play, but I thought it was important to highlight why Ajax had as much space as they did. So whilst pressing, Borussia Dortmund was set up in their 4-3-3. You've got Bellingham, Witsel and Brandt as your centre midfielders initially during the press, but once Ajax bypassed that, which they did quite a few occasions, you drop into a little bit more here of a 4-4-2 shape, with Marlon being the more defensively minded, more conservatively positioned wide midfielder. Royce obviously at this point is getting a little bit on in age, so he wasn't necessarily dropping back to cover the runs of Daley Blind, who was constantly getting into this really dangerous position around here, and then he was able to fire balls into the central spaces where you'd have the likes of Aller or maybe Gravenberch, and they'd be able to play off each other relatively easily because the fact that Borussia Dortmund had maybe covered over to, in this situation, towards their left-hand side and then had to come all the way across. The job for Bellingham is made double, triple as difficult because he's not just doing this defensive role as almost a right midfield out of possession, but then he's also having to run into the wide spaces when Borussia Dortmund were in possession. So by the end of this game, those three centre midfielders for Borussia Dortmund had covered so much ground. A little bit later on in the game, but still the same idea. So you've got Ajax, their left wing in this situation isn't actually coming across, but you've got again Berghaus really, really high on the last line. You had Anthony who was hugging the other touch line, and there's obviously a lot of space here to try and exploit against the relatively slow centre back in Hummels. And even if Borussia Dortmund are able to negate the threat of Berghaus, there's the extra threat of Aller being able to either receive a pass directly to feet, or also being able to peel off into the space as well. Okay, so slightly more elaboration on the Ajax 2-1-2-1-4, specifically with regards to Borussia Dortmund's fullbacks in Schultz and Meunier, who were tasked with typically having to rush out towards the fullbacks or wide midfielders for Ajax, whoever was kind of hugging the touchline. That often meant that they needed to be covered. In this situation, we have that here with Witsel. Obviously behind Witsel, we have an Ajax player trying to take advantage of the half space and forcing Hummels to have to come out and try and defend the half space. And that obviously creates significant space between Hummels and his centre-back partner. But potentially more importantly, it's created a lot of space here centrally in that danger zone, like zone 14 at the top of the box. So this goes back to what I mentioned earlier with Jude Bellingham having to run into the wide spaces to try and provide a little bit more support to the attacks because of the way that Borussia Dortmund were building up with narrow forwards. You are seeing both Jude Bellingham and here Brandt coming late to try and help regain possession. The second half was excellent. Ajax were constantly counter-attacking. When they did keep possession of the ball, they moved, or they were able to move Borussia Dortmund around quite easily, especially towards that last 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, where I would say they kind of had a 2-4-4 shape as shown on screen. Borussia Dortmund had made a number of substitutions, such as bringing on Hazard to try and bring a little bit more impetus to the attack, but to no avail. I think this is partially due to just how much energy was expended by the centre midfielders in their first half. During this play, Reus makes a wayward pass, and that sets up an opportunity for Borussia Dortmund to counter-press. On that wayward pass by Reus, this was nothing out of the normal for this game. Borussia Dortmund throughout often had attacks die just due to rather sloppy passes that weren't really forced errors. Of course, this is Ajax, so they're obviously going to try and pass out of the back. Unfortunately, Antony is caught on the ball by Brandt, who immediately counter-pressed once Borussia Dortmund lost possession. Fortunately, at this point, relatively early on in the game, the rest of his teammates are able to support, so you're getting a lot of them coming over to this side and really congesting this part of the pitch. Unfortunately for Borussia Dortmund, despite winning the ball in these kind of situations on a couple of occasions, they weren't able to make the right decisions to be able to capitalise on them. For example, in this scenario, the way that Marlon receives the ball, he's never intending to open up his body and be able to take it maybe towards his back foot, that left-hand side, and try and maybe pace Martinez towards that side, or just generally keep Martinez more towards his right, and that way try and go for the bottom left-hand corner of the goal. Okay, so Borussia Dortmund pressed in a number of different formations. We already mentioned the 4-3-3. We've got the typical 4-4-2 that was used a little bit later in the game. And they also tried really late on a 3-2-3-2 or a 3-2-2-3 with movement amongst the front five. At that point, it was 4-0. It couldn't get any worse. They had to try and turn the screw in Ajax because all night Ajax had been able to pass and move through their press. Despite the change in formation at this point, I think that they just lacked the energy to be able to force more mistakes out of Ajax as they had done earlier on in the game. Okay, so in this scenario, you have Ajax building up in a 3-1-4-2 versus let's say an unorthodox 4-3-3. At this point, Borussia Dortmund had brought on Hazard, so he's technically playing left midfield. Alvarez, who's technically the CDM, at least in possession, has dropped from a centre defensive midfield position into a left centre-back position to try and disrupt the press. He's also the one that ends up pulling Reus wide. Ajax used a number of ploys such as this to try and just disrupt the press of Borussia Dortmund, such as having Timber move away from a traditional right centre-back position when they were building up out of the back to create a channel to pass it into Mazraoui. So instead of him staying where he is, for example here, he'd actually move maybe 5 or 10 yards forward, so that then whoever was marking him would track him, and then you would have a lot more of a free channel behind him to pass behind him towards the fullback. So you can see that right here with Timber pushing up into more of a CDM position, and you're having Mazraoui free to be able to receive the ball from the goalkeeper. Okay, so let's talk about Borussia Dortmund's build-up. Typically in a 2-4 or a 2-3 deep, with Witsel being the CDM, but sometimes supported by Bellingham. Brandt was typically stationed a little bit higher. Whilst Borussia Dortmund tried to play it through the lines on occasion, they were also happy to kick it long because Haaland was a really willing runner, despite Martinez and Timber doing a really good job on him. One sticking with his run and then the other one trying to keep himself as a spare man so that they could try and mop up if the ball was just off. In Ajax's half, the Borussia Dortmund fullback Schultz and Meunier were tasked with holding the width, whilst the forwards of Marlon, Haaland and Reus tried to combine centrally. To try and stretch Ajax a little bit more, you would have Brandt and Bellingham float around, and they would try and work the wide spaces with the fullbacks. Although this often did leave a lot of space for Ajax to be able to counter-attack in because of how high and wide the fullbacks were positioned. So this is a good example of Borussia Dortmund trying to play out the back with Witsel and Bellingham deep, whilst Brandt and Reus try and play between the lines. Ajax typically pressed really aggressively in a 4-2-3-1 with fullbacks and centre-backs stepping out to try and press free men, whether that was Blind or Mazraoui trying to pick up the spare man in the centre midfield for Borussia Dortmund. So, for example, in this situation, Blind would probably want to be pushing up maybe towards Reus, even if that left Haaland versus Martinez and Timber without Blind being able to provide any sort of cover. I actually don't mind having their players being comfortable like that in 1v1s all over the pitch. Typically, they were really happy to try and just track the Borussia Dortmund players, such as in this example, and force them into pass backs. So seen in this scenario, eventually Korbel ends up just launching it, and you've got Ajax players tracking near-sided players for Borussia Dortmund so that there's no easy pass on, and so the attack just fizzles out. Again, another scenario with Borussia Dortmund building up out of the back. You've got your two centre-backs really split. You've got Bellingham and you've got Witsel deep to try and provide options for their centre-backs. And then you've got your fullbacks really wide, hugging the touchline. And for Ajax, in their 4-1-2-3, you've got Berghuis and Gravenberch, the centre midfielders, pushing a little bit higher, trying to put a little bit of pressure on Witsel or Bellingham if they try and float, whilst the forwards try and prevent easy passes into the fullbacks of Borussia Dortmund. I picked this scenario because Borussia Dortmund actually managed to pass through the lines of Ajax's press with a really nice round the corner pass by Bellingham, and that obviously leaves a lot of space for Borussia Dortmund to be able to try and exploit. This goes back to the point that we mentioned earlier where we said the fullbacks for Ajax were really aggressive. We've got here Dele Blind, who's not known for being particularly quick, but he's here very high up the pitch trying to immediately slow down Meunier, whilst in behind him the unsung hero potentially in Alvarez, the CDM for Ajax, is tracking the run of Royce. So this is the last example of Borussia Dortmund trying to build up out of the back. You have Hummels play into Witsel and eventually they work it into the wide space. They're able to drag a lot of Ajax's players across to that side, being that they beat the initial part of Ajax press, and they use the fact that Ajax obviously have to almost overcover to then play it out towards Borussia Dortmund's left-hand side and get into their preferred shape, which is a 3-4-3, with Chan staying a little bit deeper as like a left-sided centre-back, and then having Wolf play as the right-sided midfielder to whip in crosses. In this scenario, they do the other variation where they try and play into Haaland straight. Just mentioned earlier, Martinez and Timber, the centre-backs for Ajax, were really good at marshalling him. One of them staying with him, staying really touch tight, and then the other one kind of marking, being aware of the space that Haaland would want to burst into.